Hi, my name is Dean Taraborelli, and I'm the founder and co-director of the Sanctuary at Sedona, an addiction recovery and trauma healing center just outside of Sedona, Arizona. And I'm going to be talking to you today about the new science of holistic addiction recovery. And if you're watching this video right now, either you or someone that you know and love is suffering from addiction, whether that's to street drugs or prescription drugs. Addiction is a debilitating disease. You might also know people that are suffering from anxiety, depression, other co-occurring disorders that come with addictions. And we're going to take a journey through the process of what's new in the addiction world, what's possible. We're going to talk about the new science of epigenetics and neuroplasticity and neurogenesis. And in order to get there and understand those things, we have to talk about where we are now. We have to talk about the current scientific paradigm that's just around us that we take for granted. It's important to know a little bit about that. And then we're going to step into the new science, and then we're going to talk about some holistic practices and give a lot of data around why they're valuable to people that are suffering. So as I've been doing this talk around the country in different places, I always start by asking people to take a moment and check in and ask, what is the most important things in your life? So just take a moment now and think about that. And invariably, the things that people come up with are love, connection, a sense of belonging, that I belong in a group, I belong in a family, I belong in a community, some meaning, that this thing means something in this life that I'm going through, purpose, that I'm here, again, I've got some input into this thing. I've got a mission, a sacred purpose. Peace, that I'm at peace. Joy, that I can have some laughter and some joy. And unity, that I have belonging. And those things all point to something that we'll call the authentic self. And somewhere along the line with addiction, depression, anxiety, these things, we lose connection to our authentic self. And the loss of authentic self, many times, most of the time, actually comes from some sort of a trauma. And I want to take a moment, even though this talk is not about trauma, I want to talk about trauma for one moment. And I think most of us can agree that when we're young, little kids have a much stronger sense of who they are and much less self-consciousness about their actions and their words, and they just live and be and feel the connection and the joy of life. Something will happen, a trauma will happen, and for this discussion I want to be clear that trauma doesn't have to be a horrendous injury, shooting, beating, all the things that we see on the news that surely are terrible. Trauma can be whatever we perceive to be threatening to our well-being and our lives. And that invariably happens when we are vulnerable, then which oftentimes happens when we're young. When we have trauma, what happens is we'll go into fight or flight. And fight or flight is an autonomic nervous response where we're ready to either face danger and fight our way out of it, or we need all of our resources to run away. So the blood goes from our vital organs, the brain, the heart, all the internal organs, out to our extremities. What's really important that we'll talk about later, blood is also going from our cerebral cortex, which is our higher thinking brain, into our lower functioning survival brains. And when that fight or flight happens, very oftentimes you'll get false beliefs that get wrapped around that event about yourself, about the world, about your belonging in the world, about safety, about love, about belonging. Those false beliefs about yourself and the world affect your perceptions and your thoughts. And pretty soon you're starting to think about that. Your thinking is now slanted, biased based on that experience. That begins to then affect your feelings about yourself, the world that you live in. And of course, your feelings are connected to your body, mind-body connection. So you begin to have symptoms of sickness, anxiety, addiction, and that then translates into your life experience. So it's super important that we bring trauma into this discussion because we're looking at root causes. We are in such a great society of technology and trauma management, physical trauma management, but what about emotional trauma management? So we are so geared towards right now symptom management. So the fundamental question that we have is, can you recover? Can you recover from addiction? Can you recover your authentic self? Because if we can't recover our authentic self, that those parts of us that are important, that's the part when people are on their deathbed, they look back at their life, they wonder these questions. How did they live? And if we cannot recover our authentic self, then what is the point of all this? So I'll ask you the question, can you recover from addiction? Can you recover your authentic self? And maybe that's the same question. And further, why do you believe that? And we're going to talk about beliefs a lot during this conversation. So I want to deliver a quote from Bill Wilson, who's the founder of Alcoholics Anonymous. And he goes on to say in the foreword to the big book, "We of Alcoholics Anonymous are more than 100 men and women who have recovered from a seemingly hopeless state of mind and body." He's talking about the body-mind connection there. To show other alcoholics precisely how we have recovered. He's using that in the past tense. So I want to clear up right now from our standpoint, from the standpoint of the sanctuary at Sedona, recovery doesn't mean that we get to use one day. Why do we believe that using again, ingesting a harmful chemical, ingesting alcohol, which is a solvent, why would that be the benchmark of being recovered or our well-being? That's an interesting belief. Why do we believe that? What we mean by recovered is that we no longer identify, we're no longer defined by our past, by our labels, by our diagnoses, by our stories. That these things happen, but they cease to organize our lives today. So in modern psychology today, in the way that we're taught to think, who we are in this moment is a function of what has happened to us in the past. So I got too much love or not enough love by my parents. This happened, that happened, this happened, and this is where I am today. And as long as we keep sourcing from the past, sourcing from a past event, we're going to continue to draw resources from that. We're going to continue to bring that back into our lives. We won't be finished with it. So what we mean by recovering is starting to identify ourselves from our authentic self, from that place that's our healed self, our higher self, that part of you that is so much more than an addict, or so much more than your latest diagnosis. So when we talk about disconnecting from the authentic self, in the behavioral health field, we refer to a manual called the DSM, the DSM-4. There's a DSM-5 coming out, and that's the Diagnostic Statistic Manual of Mental Disorders. And currently now, there are 409 ways of being mentally ill. And I went through and I counted them. And occasionally in my spare time, I will sit and contemplate some of these diseases. And I've pulled out a couple of my favorites. And currently still on the top of the list is something called intermittent explosive disorder. And intermittent explosive disorder is a condition whereby people have outbreaks. They'll have road rage would be considered intermittent explosive disorder. So rather than looking at what are the pieces that are underlying, what is the unresolved anger? What are all those places in a person's life that they didn't stick up for themselves, or they didn't say what they really needed to say, or they didn't defend a point of view that's building up and they're building up, and then they'll have an outbreak, and so they'll go see someone and they'll say, well, wow, you have intermittent explosive disorder, here's a medication. And rather than getting into the core issue, now we have a diagnosis and a medication. And that person then doesn't really have to take responsibility for their well-being. You know, honey, It's not me that hit you, it's my intermittent explosive disorder. Another disorder, phase of life disorder. Like, what the heck is that? Is that when I'm a middle-aged man acting like a young man? Is that, what is that? Adjustment disorder. That's another good one. Mathematics disorder. So when I was in school, a person that had mathematics disorder, they would be a social studies teacher. They wouldn't be a mathematician. It wasn't a diagnosis. And in our current paradigm, these diagnoses, we get prescribed a pill, and this is where it all stops. That's where it ends. There's no exploration into what's going on in a person's psyche. Again, that's how we miss our core issues. So in order to really understand addiction and where it is now, let's look at the classic definition of addiction. So with addiction, we have impaired control over behavior. So that means I'm out doing things that I don't really want to do, and I'm oftentimes upset that I did them. And I think even if people aren't substance abusers watching this, there's probably nobody watching this that hasn't made a promise to themselves in the morning when they're looking in the mirror and come home at night and looked at themselves after they've let themselves down. In classic addiction, we have a preoccupation, so I'm always thinking about it. You know, it's always on my mind. When I'm doing something, I'm thinking about that. I'm thinking about when I'm at the beach with my family, I'm thinking about my drug or drinking. We build up tolerance. And probably the most important consequence of addiction is that we continue using despite consequences. And probably the most important characteristic of addiction is that we continue to use a substance, a behavior, despite its negative consequences in our life. So we know somewhere down the line we're going to be paying the piper, but I don't feel well now. So I'm going to continue to use the drug. And as I think about that classical definition, continued use despite consequences, I'm thinking about all the advertisements that I see now for antidepressants that are out on the market. And you'll see someone having a great time out, or someone that doesn't feel so good, they'll take a drug, and halfway through the commercial they begin with the side effects, which are severe: death, heart conditions, liver conditions, debilitating shakes, and all kinds of things. And people say, you know, I know that that's possible, but I'm going to take the drug anyway because I feel so bad.
Abilify is not for everyone. Call your doctor if your depression worsens or if you have unusual changes in behavior or thoughts of suicide. Antidepressants can increase these in children, teens, and young adults. Elderly dementia patients taking Abilify have an increased risk of death or stroke. Call your doctor if you have high fever, stiff muscles, and confusion to address a possible life-threatening condition, or if you have uncontrollable muscle movements, as these could become permanent. High blood sugar has been reported with Abilify and medicines like it. In some cases, extreme high blood sugar can lead to coma or death. Other risks include decreases in white blood cells, which can be serious, dizziness upon standing, seizures, trouble swallowing, and impaired judgment or motor skills.
So those people that are watching those commercials and taking those drugs, how are they different based on that classic sign of addiction? So I'm here to share now that maybe addiction is way more than what we thought it was. When we think about process addictions now, we have the computer, we have Facebook, we have smoking and money and popularity and all the things that people, iPhones, text messages, all kinds of things that people become addicted to. So we're an addicted society. So let's continue to look now at the current paradigm. So in the year 2011, last year, 2 years ago, the ASAM, which is the American Society of Addictive Medicine, came out with a new definition of addiction. And they call it a chronic disease of brain reward, motivation, memory, and related circuitry. They go on to state that addiction is a chronic disease, requires lifelong management of disease remittance maintenance protocols, similar to treating other chronic relapse illnesses like diabetes. The National Council on Alcoholism and Drug Dependence defines addiction as chronic, progressive, incurable. So that's chronic, progressive means it gets worse, incurable. They define it chronic as lasts for a long time. Incurable as insofar science has given no cure for drug addiction, or alcoholism. So in the current mainstream beliefs about addiction right now, addiction is chronic and incurable. Treatment requires a lifelong symptom managed protocol, including pharmaceuticals, behavioral and cognitive behavioral therapies. And I'm wondering, and I'm going to ask you this question right now, what if the mainstream belief about addiction is no longer true or incomplete? What would that mean to a person suffering from addiction? What would that mean to you right now if that definition wasn't accurate? And I just looked and Googled, and you see on your screen now some diseases that were once incurable that are now commonly cured: smallpox, malaria, polio, meningitis. These are, just Google them. That took 2 seconds, that search. So a while back, these things were incurable and now curable. And also interesting to know that schizophrenics that were treated in the 50s had better outcomes than schizophrenics that are treated today. And the reason why that is because people spent time with them. They did therapy with them. They treated them as humans rather than medicating them and kind of stockpiling them. So we ask the question, what then really is an addiction? So if it's maybe not all that stuff, a brain reward disease, what is it? And I'm here to introduce the fact or suggest the fact that it might be a symptom of something else. A symptom of some underlying imbalance, some underlying unresolved trauma, some underlying unresolved pattern. Is it a coping mechanism? Is it a way that we just get through the day? The stress of our society, the stress of the day, I just need something to mitigate that discomfort. We become addicted to that, or is it something else? Is addiction the ultimate wake-up call? Is our addiction telling us something that we better snap out of it and pay attention to some aspect of our life because it's killing us? And maybe that wake-up call is our call to heal and recover that authentic self. That part of us that we were talking about, that self that's real, that is above all the trials and tribulations of getting through the day. The things that people think about when they're terminally ill, people that have a heart attack or are facing now imminent death, they very don't often think about the little problems and push-pulls that they think about the important things. Maybe that's what we're called to heal in our addiction. So this comes at a time in our nation with our healthcare system the way it is. We are not a well nation. So it's time for us to begin to look for each one of ourselves to take responsibility for our own well-being. And I pulled a couple things out. Global pharmaceutical sales right now are approaching $1 trillion. In the United States in the year 2009, the sale of psychotropic drugs was $40 billion. That's $40,000 million in psychotropic medication alone. There's a word, iatrogenesis, and it's not a common word, so I'm going to define it. And iatrogenesis means death by medicine. So we have condition A, and we wind up dying of complication B. And iatrogenesis is currently the third leading cause of death in the United States. And mental health, behavioral health, is part of that statistic. There's not a lot of published research, but you can find it talking about the adverse effects of long-term use of antidepressants and antipsychotics. They make changes to the brain. When people try to come off of those things, they wind up having horrendous withdrawals that last for a pretty long time. So antidepressants and antipsychotics are addictive. Since we're on the topic, and antidepressants and antipsychotics, we want to just make clear, we believe that medication, that prescriptions were an intervention. So we don't feel well. There's something going wrong. Just like I would take an antibiotic for a virus, I would take something else to manage a finite period of time. So it's an intervention. In our country, they've turned into a lifestyle. So the most common treatment for addiction right now and related mental disorders are antidepressants and antipsychotics and other related medications. So let's talk a little bit about antidepressants because it's very interesting how they work. So serotonin management, we've all heard of the SSRI, which manages the amount of serotonin that's in the synapse. And synapse is a little space in between two neurons that it's a neurotransmitter, so it creates the pathways for information to roam around our brain. Serotonin is typically known as like a feel-good neurotransmitter. So Kelly Alexander wrote an article called The Myth of Chemical Imbalance, and there's a tremendous amount of evidence that says there's no scientific evidence to support the claim that depression, anxiety, or addiction are related to chemical imbalance. So antidepressants work. We know that they work, but how do they work? And this is a really important question. So in 1998, Kirsch and Saperstein published a meta-analysis. So a meta-analysis is where they take a whole bunch of studies on similar hypotheses and combine them, comparing the effects of antidepressant versus psychotherapy versus placebo versus no treatment. They did it for depression patients, of 3,000 patients in 38 double-blind studies. And the results are interesting. Antidepressants cause significant improvement in 75% of the patients. And in 75% of those cases, the actual drug's effectiveness could be attributed to the placebo effect. And we're going to talk about the placebo effect in a minute. Most people know it. Placebo is when we give an inert substance and the body reacts anyway. 25% of the antidepressant treatment was due to the chemical drug, so the placebo effect was 2 to 3 times as powerful as the drug effect. In 2002, they went on to analyze data from all the corporate-funded antidepressants for the top drugs of the 80s and early 90s, and that was Prozac and Paxil and the big names. And what was interesting, this study actually furthered their first study. And here's a synopsis of what they came up then. 40% of the studies conducted went unpublished, mostly because the drug failed to beat the placebo. So in those things, we can just throw those out. But due to the Freedom of Information Act, they were able to get those. With all the studies, including drugs, the placebo accounted for 82% of the effectiveness. So 82% of the time, people were getting better due to a placebo effect and not the chemical effectiveness of the drugs, at 82% of the time. So the efficacy between antidepressants and placebo were no different for mild, no different for moderate, and only a small difference for patients with severe depression. So here's a quote from The Emperor's New Drugs. Many have long been unimpressed by the magnitude of the differences observed between treatments and controls, what some of our colleagues refer to as the dirty little secret in the pharmaceutical industry. So what's happening is the control, that's the placebo, and the actual drug, there is not much different there. And when you look at $40 billion in sales compared to no sales, just an interesting statistic. And this pretty much sums it up. An NPR correspondent and Washington Post writer in 2002. After thousands of studies, hundreds of millions of prescriptions, and tens of billions of dollars in sales, 2 things are certain about pills that treat depression. Antidepressants like Prozac, Zoloft, and Paxil work, and so do sugar pills. Why? Why is that possible? Why is it that the placebo effect is outtaking the brain's natural response to heal? And a possible reason could be that the human brain has an estimated 50 trillion possible neuronic connections. So neurons fire together and create thoughts, behavior, movement. 50 trillion, that's 5 with 14 zeros. Is it possible that some lab-made pharmaceutical can micromanage, first of all, where these problems are happening, and manage 50 trillion possible synaptic connections better than the creative force of the universe, God, creator, the quantum field? Can that be possible? So we've just used a couple of words there, and it's important that we understand our science and how we got where we got today. So in order to understand the new science of addiction recovery, we have to understand the difference between classical science, which is also known as Newtonian physics, and quantum science. So in the classical paradigm, a guy named Isaac Newton came up with a theory that everything that happens in the universe happens because of conditions, and given those conditions, nothing else can happen. So it's a mechanistic world, much like a billiard ball hits another billiard ball, hits another billiard ball, hits another billiard ball, and we can measure that. So everything is predictable, like the mechanism of a clock with gears and components. In this classical version of science, the atom becomes the smallest discrete particle of matter. So the atom is the smallest thing. The space between atoms is empty space. There's nothing going on. So between us and the moon, us and the next star, me and you, there's just empty space. In this science, the body is a machine with parts. We understand the parts. We're able to fix the parts. We can understand and fix the machine. In this part, we're separate from the creative life force of the universe. We are limited by cause and effect, causality. This happens to create that reaction. What happened to me when I was young is causing who I am today. There is no way to change that. Our inner experience of feeling and belief have no effect on the world. So what's going on in here has no translation in the outside world, which means I'm basically stuck with the hand that I'm given. I'm always searching outside myself for the next fix. Everything is static and mechanistic. It's just a machine, and that's what it is. So in the quantum paradigm, interestingly enough, early in the 1900s, some people got together and they looked inside these atoms as they got more sophisticated machinery, and they saw that inside the atom were actually some neutrons and electrons and other particles inside of there. So the atom wasn't the smallest piece. And when they looked in there, they found that they were made of empty space. There was nothing inside of them. So in essence, there's nothing inside an atom. What's in there is energy. And since we're made of atoms, cells are made up of atoms, and tissues are made up of cells, that means that in essence, we're made up of energy. So in the quantum paradigm, energy is the basis of everything. Everything is made of energy at the essential level. And the universe, our world, our bodies, each other are made up of a shared field of energy referred to as the quantum field, the divine matrix, God, the field. In quantum physics, everything in this field influences everything else. So there is nothing that is separate. And we know that from a principle called entanglement. That's when two things are connected and they are separated by any distance. They both have a knowingness of each other. They act as if they are still linked. In the quantum paradigm, human DNA directly influences and is interfacing with this field in a way that appears to define time and space. In this paradigm, human belief, that's emotions, feelings, thoughts, directly changes DNA. And we're going to talk about that in a little bit. That's a fairly bold statement. DNA affects what happens in the field. when we shift ourselves, our beliefs about ourselves and the world, the field translates that into the change of the reality of daily life. So somehow in this paradigm, we've heard this, the observer is creating reality. Thoughts, feelings, beliefs, and emotions are creating not only the way your body is healing, but the way that you're interfacing with reality. There's intentionality. There's something about human intention, expectation. So somehow in this quantum paradigm, what we think about, what we expect, affects not only our bodies, but affects the outside world. And the problem is that we are unconsciously creating what we don't want. So there's a little bit of a video that really explains quantum physics in a very short way, and I'm just check back in with you after you see it. So here it is.
In the everyday world, most of us like to believe that stuff exists. In other words, objective reality is an actual thing, and our choices about whether or how to perceive it shouldn't change the truth. But quantum physics says that actual reality isn't so simple. How so? Let's say you have a flashlight and you point it at a wall with two open doors. The light will pass through both doors at the same time. And if you do this in exactly the right way, you'll see a pattern form on the far wall. It's caused by light waves from your flashlight interfering with themselves as they pass through the doors. And you'll get the same pattern even if you shrink everything down so your flashlight only puts out one photon at a time. Now it's perfectly okay for a wave to pass through two doors at once. But just to be sure, let's say you put a particle detector at one of the doors. When you do this, you find that the photon actually does pass through one door or the other. But as soon as you catch it in the act, that lovely interference pattern that you had before goes away. Somehow the photon is no longer a wave, but acts more like a particle instead. And all you did was try to measure it. Now you might think this is just some weird property of light, but the same experiment also works for particles of matter, like electrons and protons, even large molecules, like buckyballs. So how does a proton or electron or buckyball know whether it's supposed to be a particle or a wave? Its true nature shouldn't depend on how we choose to look at it. It should be one or the other, right? Well, let's go back to the experiment, but this time let's just have one device that can either detect a particle or a wave. After the photon passes through the doors, we can just ask the device whether it went through one door or both. And we can't have any effect on the photon's choice because we're simply observing it after the fact. It either went through one door or both, right? Yeah, not so much. In real actual experiments, if you set the device to look for a particle, you'll find that the photon behaved as a particle passing through one door or the other. If you instead set the device to look for a wave, you'll find that the photon passed through both doors, like a wave. This basically means that you, the observer, can decide whether the photon goes through one door or both after it already went through. That'd be like flying from LA to San Francisco, then once you land, you find out you actually drove. This experiment has been repeated and repeated in all sorts of different ways, and the results are always the same. Look for a wave, and you see a wave. Look for a particle, and you see a particle. Look for something halfway between a wave and a particle, and you see something halfway between a wave and a particle. In other words, as soon as you try to figure out what the true reality of light or matter actually is, you find that the answer depends on you. That doesn't mean that objective reality can't exist, but it may actually be influenced by what we choose to see.
It's so interesting, and we've all heard this stuff about quantum physics and the quantum world, and thoughts create reality, and we're creating our own reality. But what does that mean to me? I keep creating the reality of suffering, of addiction, of being not present for my life and suffering. So I want to just go over a couple of studies, a couple of examples of how this stuff works. And so there was a study at McGill University where they had a person that was very connected to plants, a healer, went and took care of plants and watered them and prayed over them and was caring about them. And that was one set of plants. And then they took a psychotic who was depressed and had him water and care for the plants too. They were watered the same amount and cared for in the same way. But the researchers found out that the plants that the healer was taking care of fared much better than the plants that the psychotic took care of. So somehow the belief system, somehow what was going on internally for these two men affected the plants that they were taking care of. So in the next study that's just worth mentioning about, there was the love study. So the Institute of Noetic Sciences did a study of husbands and wives, and what they did was a husband watching his wife without her knowledge when she was resting could affect her pulse and her perspiration. And during the times when the husband wasn't looking, her pulse and respiration went back to normal. So they did this in 36 double-blind studies. So somehow the act of a person looking and sending their partner loving thoughts affected them physically. The Institute of Heart Math, and that's worth looking up, this was a group of people, and we'll talk about them again later, that studied the connection between the heart and the mind. And what they came up with in their studies, they took some individuals that were trained in emoting feelings. So they took therapists that knew how to emote love and kindness, and also knew how to emote anger and frustration. And they took some DNA and put it in vessels, and when the people projected love and feelings of gratitude, the DNA actually expanded, it relaxed. Conversely, when they sent anger and frustration into human DNA, not even their own, this is in a vessel, the DNA got contracted, it tightened up and switched off some of its genetic code, stress. And they did that externally. They then followed up and did a test on sending HIV patients positive feelings and found that their immune response increased by 300,000% by external, someone emoting a certain feeling towards them. So we've heard about the power of prayer, and that people get better with the power of prayer, and there's something about that. There's something tangible about it. So these are actual studies where our thoughts have affected somehow the quantum field, affected the world around us. So now that we have a little bit of the science, let's talk about the new science of holistic addiction recovery. And this science is really new, and it's really exciting for people that are suffering. So the first science I want to talk about is the science of epigenetics. And epi means on top of genetics, and this is the study of heritable changes in the gene function without changing the gene sequence. And what this means is that DNA, we inherit a pattern of DNA, but whether that DNA expresses itself or not is dependent on external stimulation. So epigenetics examines the signals that turn genes on and off and control genetic expression. It shows that genes are influenced by our environment. The cover of Time magazine in 2010 talked about DNA expression is not fixed. And they talk about something called adaptive mutation. So genes are adapting to the environment. They're not depending on our decisions to take care of the species. So they're feeling the world around them and changing. That's called adaptive mutation. So what this means is that we are not necessarily stuck with our patterns of addiction, depression, anxiety, all the things that have been passed down. The science of epigenetics means that we might have a chance to turn that expression on and off. And we're going to see a video by Bruce Lipton, who's a researcher.
So epi means above, and if you say epigenetic control, then that translates as control above the genes. And that is like the difference between either controlled by the genes or your control is above the genes. And when you're controlled by the genes, you're a victim of your genes. When you're controlled by something above your genes, then that controls your genes. And it turns out the mind is what's above the genes. And it's the mind that controls the genes. And when people in the world can own this, not as, well, that's a neat idea, but as a fact, then it says, well, if you want to change your life and you want to express different characters or traits, then it's incumbent upon you to know that your mind is involved with actually creating that ability, that behavior, that genetic expression that allows you to control what you want in your life. So we go from victim to master in this new biology.
So he has done a tremendous amount of research on this and came to the conclusion that our subjective states of mind, our consciously motivated behavior can modulate gene expression and optimize health. So what you think about and how you feel translate into what is happening in your body. That's the mind-body connection, and it's documented through the science of epigenetics. What does that mean for people suffering from addiction? I, in my history of addiction treatment, have heard this is a genetically inheritable disease. My father had it, his father had it, I'm stuck with it, and there's nothing we can do. Well, maybe that's not true. Maybe that's not true. And what does that mean for addiction treatment if it's not? Our next science that I want to introduce, some new science that has come out in the last decade or two, is called neuroplasticity. And what neuroplasticity means is that the brain is not a fixed organ with a certain amount of synapses, a certain structure as we thought that it was. It means that the brain is actually able to rewire itself and create new neural networks, allowing us to overcome traumatic, instinctual, and emotional responses, as well as adapt to brain injuries. So the way that this all came to be, when stroke victims, what they would do is a person would have a stroke and they would get damage to a certain part of their brain. Researchers would translate that into a certain aspect of body function. This part of the brain affects motor skills in the right arm, for example. And when a person went through the process of actually going to rehabilitation and learning to use their arm again, that process of learning to use a body part again, and then they would do an MRI and find out that the brain part that was doing that skill in the first place is still damaged. So the brain uses a different part of the brain to take over that function. So that means that following a certain protocol, we can adapt and alter our brain hardware. Let's go back to that ASAM definition of disease, that it's a brain reward disease, brain disease. Well, neuroplasticity means that, hey, even if that's true, we might be able to use a different part of our brain, become normal again. So neuroplasticity is, just to go over it, brain cells with neurons communicate with one another by passing chemical messengers. They're called neurotransmitters at a functional point called a synapse. One neuron, one brain cell, can have thousands of different synapses. So neurobiological studies demonstrated that synapses play an important part in learning, memory, aging, stress management, addiction. So what that means is that a neuron sends a signal down, depending on what the command is, sends signals to different synapses to get picked up by other synapses, creating movement, creating thought. So neuroplasticity, and I'll just read it, it's important. Synaptic plasticity refers to changes in the strength of a given synapse. Though it was once believed that synapses were fixed, they were simple way stations transferring information from one cell to another. It's now known that the strength of a synapse, or its ability to influence the behavior of other receiving cells, can be altered through its own activity as part of a larger network. The more a synapse is used, the stronger it becomes, and the more it influences others in its network. So that means cells that fire together, wire together. This becomes a habit. As we do things over and over and over again, we build neural pathways. And that then becomes a subconscious behavior. So those are habits. So the long-term potential, that's repetitive chemical communication between two cells over time, strengthens the synapse, resulting in an amplified response in the postsynaptic cell. Simply stated, that means that LTP enhances cell communications by allowing the postsynaptic and postsynaptic cells to communicate faster and more efficiently. The synaptic strengthening is long-lasting and thought to underlie learning and memory. So as we do something over and over and over, we're creating a habit. Then, when we use drugs of abuse, So we get a stronger reward in there. That's actually amplifying that effect. So what does this mean? Neuroplasticity, it's naturally occurring. It's how we learn. It's how we can adapt, overcome. It's how I learn a new skill. When a person learns a new instrument, they'll sit down at the instrument, and each keystroke is painstaking. We have to concentrate on it until we build the neural pathways, and then pretty soon each keystroke becomes unconscious. They can just do it, and the more we practice, the more those synaptic connections are strengthened. It becomes a habit. And what's amazing about neuroplasticity is that it's naturally occurring. This is something that the brain is doing all the time. So we adapt, we overcome, we can heal diseases. That's how we evolve. Every thought, every feeling is creating the possibility of new neural pathways. So this becomes super important for addiction recovery. So neuroplasticity can be directed intentionally. That's what learning is. We set our mind to focus on the same thing over and over. We're intentionally creating new neural pathways. This can be enhanced also by certain things that stimulates the brain's ability to create BDNF, which is brain-derived neurotrophic factor, to stimulate the NRF2 pathways, and to create ketones. These are all things that the brain does to repair itself and take care of itself. Something else that we can take externally is DHA, fish oil. Mother's milk is 40% DHA. Currently, our old sources of fish oil don't have any oil in them anymore. Farm-raised fish doesn't have DHA. Farm-raised fish eat corn, they don't eat algae. So the brain neuroplasticity, the neuroplastic effects of the brain are amazing for the field of addiction recovery because we can grow a new brain. We're growing a new brain. So Joe Dispenza is a researcher that healed himself through his thoughts, through conscious use of neuroplasticity. We're going to listen to a very short clip from him.
There's a concept in neuroscience called neuroplasticity. And neuroplasticity tells us that we're changed by every thought we think, everything we learn, every experience we have, every dream we embrace, that the brain is plastic throughout our entire lives, and it allows us to modify our behaviors to do a better job in life.
So the most important thing is that neurons that fire together wire together. That's how we create a habit. Neural pathways that don't fire together lose their connection. So it's like you got to use it or lose it. So this becomes super important because we can unlearn addictive behavior. And that's what a lot of early recovery is. We're doing other things instead of engaging in our addictive behavior. But how do we do that permanently? How do we take conscious control of our brain's adaptive abilities and use them on our behalf? What does that mean for a person suffering from addiction? So wouldn't we want to know about the neuroplastic component of the brain and start to heal using that rather than just say, oh my God, there's something wrong with me and I better take another pill that actually inhibits the conscious neuroplastic effects that we want, actually creating new neural pathways of other things that we probably don't want. So we talk about neurogenesis. And neurogenesis is the brain's ability to create brand new neurons. So up until fairly recently, it was believed that you were born with a static amount of brain cells. So when I was a little kid, my mother used to say, you know, every time you smoke in one of those joints, there's 10,000 brain cells out the window. She read that in Reader's Digest because she read me the article. And every shot of alcohol, 10,000 brain cells. So eventually you keep doing that, you're going to run out of them and you're going to be fried of brain cells. Well, we're finding out that that's not true. That the brain is actually capable of making new neurons, growing new neurons. What does that mean for a person that's got an addicted brain? It means we can grow a new one. And again, what you eat and how you take care of your brain, what you think about and so forth becomes super important in how your brain grows. So neurogenesis is super exciting for the field of addiction recovery, because we can change the brain we have and grow new brain cells, and that is super exciting. So our next new science that I thought was really worth mentioning something called Psychoneuroimmunology, and that studies the connection between our thoughts and the human immune system and the nervous system. And what basically, to sum up a lot of science, is how you think affects how you feel. So we start to have depressive thoughts, our body doesn't feel well, then our body responds by saying, hey, I don't feel well, and feeds that up to the brain. Gosh, I don't feel well. Now the brain takes that in. Wow, I'm thinking how I'm feeling, and I'm feeling how I'm thinking. This becomes a closed circuit, and this is how people get stuck in depression, stuck in anxiety. So just because we're depressed, and we've been depressed because for a long time I've been thinking depressive thoughts, I'm going into those depressive things, I'm sending that to my body's sending that up to the brain, that doesn't necessarily mean that we have a chemical imbalance. It means that the system is functioning. Our depression meter is way down here. Now the question becomes, how do we get it back? Do we need to use a medication for the short term, which is perfectly fine. You know, there's no point in suffering any longer than we have to. But if we continue to think depressive thoughts and so forth, then our body is going to respond in kind. So if we start to take better care of our mind and our body, all of a sudden our body is thinking better thoughts, our body feels like we think, and we think the way we feel, and as we're feeling better, we start to think better. As we think better, we start to feel better. And this is a very exciting science for the field of addiction recovery. And you notice I'm not using the words addiction treatment, because by treating an addiction, we're treating a symptom. Well, this is about addiction recovery. So if we think how we feel and we feel how we think, we've got to do everything that we can to begin to feel and think differently. Makes total sense, right? It's like a no-brainer. The last science I want to talk about is something called interpersonal neurobiology. And what that is a multidisciplinary, which means a lot of different kinds of science, every kind of science feeding into this relationship between the mind and our external relationships. What is the mind? And how does it get information? How does it interact with other minds and affect how we're feeling? So multidisciplinary to me means holistic. And it's a scientific approach to look at how we're interacting with those around us to shape our lives and our well-being. Does this new science sound too good to be true? If for some reason it's true, why is it that you don't hear about it? Why don't you know about this if you're addicted or depressed or anxious? I'm going to introduce something now, and one of my favorite quotes from Alan Schopenhauer talks about new beliefs. And all truth passes through 3 stages. First, it is ridiculed. Oh yeah, the earth is round. Sure it is. You know, everybody makes a joke about it. Second, it's violently opposed. Wow. The earth is round, what do you arrest that person? Somehow we now have resistance. Wow, what I'm thinking, I have to change that, I'm protecting that. And then finally, the third stage is they are just accepted as commonly understood. So when we talk about whether this science is quack science or is it an undiscovered truth? So all this stuff that I'm talking about, is it just some quack science? Well, quack science is the promotion of unproven medical practices, snake oil salesmen. So that's quack science. Science is knowledge covering the general truths about the operation of general laws. So it has to do with the world around us. We come up with a hypothesis. We test our hypotheses against facts. If the facts don't support the hypothesis, we get rid of the hypothesis, we reevaluate the hypothesis till we come up with a model for what becomes the truth of the universe. Science is verifiable and repeatable. What's interesting is that when we're talking about placebo and all those things, they're not so repeatable in the laboratory, but aren't they science? Because we sure are using them in a scientific way. If the placebo effect is quack science, then why are we comparing every new drug? So we can't have it both ways. So holistic medicine is on the fringe, but I'm not sure that we can call it quack science. So I'm going to quote an article from Nature in 2002 that talks about science being incomplete. So by nature, even at its most exact and profound, science is incomplete in its explanations but self-correcting as it steers itself away from the occasional wrong path. So science realizes it's going down the wrong path. Eventually it will fix it. Eventually somebody will come up with something that disproves this, and hey, we self-correct. What's interesting and super important for you is that this self-correction can take years, decades, or even centuries. Go back to the Earth being flat. That took hundreds of years before it came out to be a mainstream accepted belief. So this bit about science being incomplete, we're still discovering things all the time. So for us to think that our science is complete is something that we might want to consider that. We think that we're on the zenith and this is all we're ever going to know. That might be something worth reevaluating for your recovery. And one piece of science that is incomplete that I can give you is the theory of everything, the unified theory. So we talked about quantum physics, and that's things that are very small, quantum particles, when we think we affect them, and then very large things, the cause and effect world of planets. We can't think Mercury into being something else than a planet. It's already there. But there's no connection between the quantum and the classical theory, but we're working on it. So that's how science is incomplete. So I'll give you a scientific fact that quantum energy can exist in two different forms, and we saw a little video. It can be either a particle or a wave. The energy is still there, it just shows up as a particle or a wave. And what's really interesting, whether it shows up as a particle or a wave depends on whether we're expecting it to show up as a particle or a wave. That's why we have double-blind studies. All of the medication that we've been talking about goes through a double-blind study, because just by virtue of the person knowing whether they have a placebo or not affects that. So it's not like the researcher walks in and hands somebody a placebo and gives them the wink-wink so they know. This person, even knowing, affects how that person reacts to the placebo. And whether this person knows, even the person that sent that person in knows. So somehow there's no scientific experiment that is completely objective. So a quantum particle can be in more than one place at a time. And super interesting to understand that. That's not two things. It's one thing in two or more places. And once these particles go into two or more places, no matter how great of distance that we separate them, they have a knowingness of each other, an awareness of each other. Two people that come together that are separated somehow have an awareness of each other. Does anybody ever have the experience of thinking of somebody, your old roommate from school, and go to call them, you pick up the phone and they're on the other line calling you in that moment? That's those two particles, those two things have an awareness of each other in that moment. So what's interesting is that you and I are made of quantum energy. So your beliefs matter. Here's a scientific fact. Here's another scientific fact. The Weizmann Institute in Israel in 1998 came up and it says it all. Quantum theory demonstrated. Observation affects reality. And I'll read it. The studies prove that rather than being buffered from our world and the things that make up life what it is, we're intimately connected with everything, from ourselves or our bodies to the atoms to the world and beyond. Our experience of consciousness expresses feelings and belief is doing the connecting. Our feelings are connecting with this quantum field. The act of us looking at our world, projecting our thoughts and feelings and belief out on the world, changes the particles that world is made of in real time. That's the quantum theory. So, and it's not a theory, it's the truth. We're not only affecting our internal reality, we're affecting our external reality. Talking about quack science, is our pharmacology based on real science? Because pharmacology is based on the placebo. Every new drug that comes out has to be tested against a placebo. A placebo is a harmless pill given for more of a psychological effect than a physiological effect. It's basically a sugar pill that has no therapeutic effect. And what we're finding out is that since the placebo effect can't be replicated. Is it real science? Well, if it's not real science, if it's quack science, then why are we using it to compare it against all the medication that we're taking? So here's what's really interesting about the placebo effect. In 1955, there was a man named Henry Beecher who wrote a paper that became the benchmark and is still cited today. And across 15 studies involving a variety of conditions, including pain, headache, anxiety, even seasickness, found out that 1 out of 3 patients showed a significant improvement when giving a placebo. So the placebo is effective up to 35% of the time, regardless of the disease, cross diseases. So it's become the most used phenomenon in medicine, but the least studied, at least in open research. I can tell you that the pharmaceutical companies know more about placebo because they're, of course, by the nature of business, you've got $1 billion or whatever tied up in the testing of a new drug. That they want to get it to pass. You know, that's all understandable. But what we need to do is stop and think, instead of saying, oh, that's just the placebo, let's take a real drug, the power of the placebo and how important that is. And how is it that an inert pill can be just as effective as a chemical compound that you ingest? And what does that? Well, it's tied to beliefs. So this placebo effect then is an important phenomenon. So rather than someone in science saying, wow, that's the placebo effect, look at the healing capability that the human body has to take care of itself, instead we're led to believe, oh, that's just the placebo effect. That doesn't mean it, that's just a placebo. So how is it that an inert pill can have the same or more powerful effect than an actual chemical substance? And it has to do with belief. So the placebo effect, interestingly enough, is not just one thing. The placebo effect actually is influenced by the condition a person has, how the placebo is administered. So a pill is less effective than a shot. A person that gets a shot of saline solution typically has a stronger belief that that's going to help them. It's a stronger medication. The color, the price, the dose, that all affects how well it does. Taking pills 4 times a day versus 2 times a day or 1 time a day. The higher the price, the better the placebo effect works. There's something called an enhancing placebo, and that's a placebo that has a side effect to it. So sometimes they'll use something that makes you itch. So a person that's taking that placebo knows something is going on, they're itching, saying, wow, something's happening. They have a stronger effect than a person that doesn't have that. So they find out that actual surgery is more effective than a pill or a shot. There was a guy in Houston, Texas that was working at the VA hospital, and they were doing arthroscopic surgery on knees and talking about whether they should actually rinse the joint out and then scrape it, which would be better. So they decided, they conducted a survey, and they gave 180 patients were involved, and in a third of them, they just rinsed the joint. And in the second third of them, they rinsed and scraped the joint. And in the third set of people, they just made the incision, but they didn't do anything to the joint. So that's called placebo surgery. And what they would do is they would just cut the skin and go through the process, and the doctor would say, nurse, give me this and that. So the patient would believe that they were having surgery, placebo surgery. And here are the results. 2 weeks after the surgery, the placebo group reports significantly less pain than either group and can walk up the stairs and climb better. 1 year after the operation, the placebo group still walked and climbed stairs significantly better than either other group. And 2 years after the surgery, there were no significant difference between the 3 groups. So interestingly enough, the placebo group did better than the actual groups that got scraped and or rinsed and scraped. Here's an interesting phenomenon. Between 2001 and 2006, The percentage of new products cut from development after phase 2 clinical trials rose by 20%. So it's not that the drugs are getting weaker, it seems that the placebo effects are getting stronger. And they're saying that actually now if some of those drugs in the 80s actually came onto market today, they may not make it, the Prozacs and Zolofts of the world. So somehow the placebo is getting more traction, it's getting more efficacy. It's working. Here's an interesting quote. Certainly among psychiatrists, there's a fair amount of concern because of the high placebo responses. That's out of the University of Miami. Interesting comment that doctors, rather than be excited about the placebo effect and what it means for people in healing, because they can't control it, because it seems to be unpredictable, we're nervous about it. So is the placebo effect quantum science? Is that what we're talking about? Somehow our thoughts are affecting reality. Here's a scientific fact. Your beliefs matter. The act of us simply looking at our world, projecting the feelings and beliefs that we have as we focus our awareness on the particle that the universe is made of, we change those particles while we're looking at them. So here's the question. How do you influence your health? How do you create your own reality? Thoughts, feelings, beliefs, emotions. So somehow the placebo effect is tied to a belief. It's tied to a belief. If we think that something is going to help us, we tend to get an effect from it. So let's talk about beliefs since they're so tied to how well we feel. And remember, we tied them in right at the beginning. When we talked about trauma, we have our authentic self, then we get all kinds of false beliefs that affect our perceptions, that begin to affect our bodies and the way we perceive the world and our life experience. So a belief is an assumed truth. It's a psychological state where an individual holds a proposition or a premise to be true. It's a belief, it's a conviction of the truth or reality of something, and it's typically based on evidence. And your beliefs are what form a mental construct around you. And I'll tell you that your beliefs affect your behavior. So every behavior that you have is tied to some kind of a belief, right from brushing your teeth in the morning to what color you wear that day to how you drive to work, the kind of car you drive, the kind of relationships you have are tied to a belief. So these things are so important, beliefs. How do we get them? Well, we have experiential things. So I know that every time I go over there, I get attacked by a stranger. That means my belief is it's dangerous over there. I've learned that. Beliefs are also adopted unconsciously by society, by teachers, by family. They're given to us. So most of us have beliefs that we've never even thought of. Things that govern our lives that were handed to us. And if you're anything like me, nobody handed me a questionnaire when I was born saying, hey, you want to believe in this, you don't want to believe in that, you want to believe in this, you don't want to believe in that. Just by a function of where we were born, who we're born to, the society that we live in affects how we believe. Beliefs typically have a very strong emotional component to them. There's something else. It's not just a fact. Somehow when we talk about politics, we know not to discuss God or politics at a party, right? Because people have strong reactions to them. Abortion and stem cell research and 9/11. People are charged about these things. Why is it that we try to impose our beliefs on someone else? Why is it so important that you subscribe to my belief? So belief, as Greg Braden, and he's a researcher, scientific research, an experience that happens in both our bodies and our minds, the acceptance of what we think is true in our minds married with what we feel in our hearts. So belief are typically tied to some kind of an identity for us. That's why we're so strongly, that's why, back to that quote from Schopenhauer, all new ideas go through 3 stages. First, it's ridiculed. Oh, that's crazy. Second of all, oh, no way. That's interfering with my way of looking at the world. And third, it just is accepted as common. What's interesting is that belief is the basis for every perception that you have. So an example of that being that let's say you have an experience when you're young, you're driving down the street and the police stop your family and take your father out of the car and beat him up. So 30 years later, you look at someone in a uniform and your perception is that that's a negative person. You're not thinking about it. It's not going back to that episode, but somewhere along the line, that perception is tied to the belief that that police is going to give you a hard time. So conversely, let's say you have an experience when you're young that you're broken down on the side of the road and the police come and they put you in the back of the car and they have hot chocolate and donuts and all that and they take you home and it's nice and warm. Well, 30 years later, you look at a person in uniform and you say, wow, that's a good feeling. I perceive that to be a friendly person. That's perception based on a belief. So again, two people, I believe in UFOs, somebody else doesn't. We go outside and we see a flash across the sky. I'm going to say, wow, that's a UFO. That's my perception. And the other person will say, that was an airplane or a weather balloon or whatever. Beliefs affect our perception. So your entire worldview, your life experience is based on your beliefs, including your health. So if what you feel affects your perceptions, perception, let's talk about that for a moment, just so we know. Perception is the process which we translate sensory input into a coherent worldview. So perception is awareness shaped by belief. So therefore, beliefs affect perception. Perception influences behavior. So that same person in uniform, if I perceive them to be bad or harmful to me, I might run away from them. That's my behavior. I'll run away. If I perceive them to be friendly, I'll just keep doing what I'm doing or actually go talk to them. So perception influences my behavior. Perception influences my genes. So beliefs affect perceptions that affect our self-esteem, our self-worth, who we marry, who we wind up with, our financial well-being, our physical well-being, our addiction. Beliefs affect our addiction. So if this becomes now the root, how I feel is translating into my life experience, as we've demonstrated through the science, the quantum physics, through epigenetics, I can change my DNA. Through neuroplasticity, I can actually change the workings of my brain based on how I feel and what I believe. So this is where we get to the importance of holistic addiction recovery. How you feel is going to determine how you can recover. What you believe, if you believe that you are an addict and you are stuck, then that's exactly where you will be. And if you believe that you're not, then something else might be possible for you. And we've just demonstrated that through all this science, and I've had that own experience in my life. That's what we're teaching people at the sanctuary. So let's talk about holistic for a moment, and let's talk about holistic science and how this all works. So first of all, what do we mean by holistic addiction recovery? Well, that means holistic means whole. We're treating the whole person. We have all heard body, mind, spirit. We introduced the word soul, and a lot of people watching this video may not have a concept of what the soul means, but we probably have a connection to it when we think about it. And we're going to talk about it in a little bit. And what's super interesting about that, if there's disease, discomfort in any of those areas, if they're connected, that means that disease also must have a counterpart in those other areas. It also means that if we work on all these areas at the same time, our chances of getting better are actually significantly increased. So the body, the mind, the soul, and the spirit, they each have a unique access point, a unique way of interfacing with them. And that's the whole trick of holistic addiction recovery. So I just want to talk about these four components for a minute and just get a sense of what they are. The body. Well, when we talk about the body, we all seem to know this thing, but when we talk about the body, I'll ask, what body? The body today or the body 5 years ago? Because you don't have any cells in your body that you were born with, and you don't have any cells in your body that just were there 5 years ago. So the body is in a constant state of renewal. Billions of cells every day die and get cast out, and billions are born. So the body is a place of systems and organs and molecular structures. So the body is also the sacred container for our soul, for our heart. That's the body. So we talk about something called cellular memory. How do cells know of sickness? If we're always growing new cells, why do we grow new sick ones instead of new well ones? Let's talk about the mind for a second. And interestingly enough, there is no definition for the mind. The mind and the brain are two totally different things. So in our conversation here, we're going to use the term mind, but we're really talking about the brain. And the brain is nothing but an electrochemical factory. The brain is also informed by the spirit. It's an antenna to spirit in some way. The brain is the generator of thoughts, feelings, emotions, consciousness. We have higher brain function, we have lower brain function. So remember, we talked about trauma way back early in the talk. So trauma elicits fight or flight, which sends blood from our higher brain functions down to our lower brain functions. So that lives in the limbic brain. So a little anatomy of the brain is there's the brain stem, that's called the reptilian brain. That's just about functioning of the body. Your reptilian brain is what keeps you breathing. So it's impossible to commit suicide by holding your breath. The reptilian brain won't allow that. Then on top of that, we have the mammalian brain, and that's where emotions are stored. That's where trauma is also stored. There's no consciousness there. Then we have the cortex. That's where higher brain functions. Then we have the prefrontal lobes, which is called the God brain. So as we go into fight or flight trauma, all the blood, all the attention, all the activity goes down into survival mode, and we lose track of those higher brain functions, and that's typically where we're going to find our authentic self. We're going to find healing, recovery, all meaning in life. That's what makes us human and separates us from other beings that don't have a prefrontal cortex. The interesting thing about trauma will live in the limbic brain until it is healed. And it doesn't know time, and this is why it's so important to understand the resolution of trauma, because since the limbic brain doesn't understand time, we don't know whether this trauma happened 50 years ago or 5 minutes ago or now. We go into that same fight or flight when that's stimulated by similar circumstances. So the mind is the place of perception. The mind is the place of process. Now's where it gets a little bit more interesting and a little bit more nebulous, and we talk about the soul. And the soul is this place that we are connected to our heart's desires. Sometimes the soul can be synonymous with the heart, and people hear this expression, follow your heart. Listen to your heart. It's interesting, the heart sends more information to the brain than the brain does the heart. So the soul is this place of the sacredness, of meaning, purpose, joy, creativity. It's this place of authentic expression and connection and love. I can tell you that all of your gifts, when we talk about why you're here and the meaning of your life and what you're on this planet to do, those are all soul things. Your talents and creativity are in that soul place. This is where we get richness and meaning in life. Let's talk about spirit for a moment. What is spirit? Well, spirit is this thing. We talked about the totality of the quantum field, of the field of God, whatever that is. There have been volumes and volumes of books written on spirit. For our intent and purpose, we're going to talk about spirit as the human energy system, which becomes our antenna. It's a field of energy around our bodies. This can be seen now with Kirlian photography, so it's documented. And this field serves as the blueprint for what happens to us and takes in that life force energy, prana. And the spirit becomes a place that stores imprints. So we'll talk about that in a little bit, but that's about the body, mind, soul, and spirit. And interestingly enough, those things have different ways of interfacing with them. And when we do interface with them and we can help get healing to happen, then we move from symptoms to causes. We move to healing versus curing. We move from being in recovery to being in a state of being recovered. So we get to the root cause of what's going on. We're looking at the whole of everything. At the sanctuary, we use something called radical transformation, and we call it radical because it's radical, it's intense, it's We call it transformation because we're talking about changing from one thing to another. Change. We need change. If you're watching this video and you've got an addictive pattern, you need change. If you're on medication and it's no longer working for you, it's now interfering with the beauty of your life or your creativity or what you're here to do, then we need to change. We need to transform, and we need to not just have a fix, but to change our whole belief structure, our whole way we interact with the world. Back to the body. Here's what we do for the body. We talk about cellular release of trauma. So somehow the cells in our bodies are all conscious. They all perform a function, they all take in nutrition, they all expel toxins, they all communicate with cells around them and perform a function. They are independent. They hold memory. And what we do about that is we do body work, a lot of integrative body work to help release cellular trauma. We do breath work, we do somatic experiencing. We have a certain food protocol. And anybody watching this video, if you think it's just drugs you're putting in your body that affect how you feel, well, the way that foods are now and food allergies, particularly with addicts, people have radical changes when they change the way that they eat and change their relationship to certain kind of foods that they might be allergic to. Supplements, super important to get the brain back into balance, get the body back strong again. Detoxification, movement, exercise, yoga. Here's a couple of facts. Exercises reduces depressive symptoms in patients with chronic illness. Another study, yoga and PTSD. So in a randomized study, they took a bunch of veterans, and these veterans were diagnosed with severe PTSD. Persons were also heavy drinkers and taking antidepressants. And they found that 6 weeks after the study began, the control group of people increased markedly. And these improvements continued after a 6 months follow-up. And interestingly enough, the ones that didn't do any yoga stayed the same. Therapeutic massage. 37 studies, again, a meta-analysis, a whole conglomeration, talked about the effectiveness of relief of depression and anxiety was similar with massage as that of psychotherapy. So this is a documented fact. So therapeutic massage is not just a feel-good. When we have the right intention, as we do, it's about releasing cellular memory. So let's talk about the mind. Psychotherapy, psychiatry, these are important. Nutrition, supplements, we've got to get the brain working again. We need to resolve those underlying conflicting beliefs. Because I'm going to tell you that if you're sitting watching this video and you want to have a better life and you go out and hurt yourself with drinking or using or some codependent behavior, then you've got some conflicting underlying beliefs that need to be resolved, or you're going to continue to hurt yourself. With the mind, we create new neural pathways, start to consciously create new habits. And our whole thing is resolution of trauma. We resolve the underlying traumas around our family, around our abuse, around our self-esteem issues. So, interesting for the mind, meditation has been shown to increase immune system functioning and have similar benefits to antidepressants. This is a study. So meditation, they took a study of people that had been doing transcendental meditation for 30 years, and they showed that they had lower response to stress and pain compared to a control group. What was interesting, when they trained the control group, they wound up having the same 40 to 50% lower response. So people learn to meditate, it affects right away, and they have amazing results. Here's something about meditation and addiction. So people that participated in the mindfulness meditation experienced reduced cravings, had higher levels of awareness, and typically did better than their unmeditating counterparts. So meditation has been shown to individuals who cope with mental health issues, trauma, anxiety, depression. So the soul. How do we heal the soul? Again, remember, we have different entry points for these things. The soul doesn't understand reasoning and logic. The soul works by creative expression, ritual, ceremony, nature, sacredness. Our life goes from archetypical to this mythic journey. What's interesting is rites of passage are a very soul thing, and they're actually very healing, and they're used in many cultures. Somewhat in ours, we have weddings. People go into a wedding through a ritual. Interestingly enough, not many of us understand what the rituals really mean and how they affect the limbic brain. So that's the soul and interfacing through the soul. It's interesting. I refer to step 11. Again, we're a non-12-step program, but I'm referring to step 11, sought through prayer and meditation to improve our conscious contact with God. Bill Wilson said it right there. We're all talking about the same thing. I'll bring up heart math. Heart math is a soul thing. It's a heart thing. So they're finding that there's signals between the heart and the mind, and when the heart is sending the brain coherent signals, calm signals, the brain responds in a calm way. Conversely, when the heart is sending choppy signals up there, when the heart is reacting to stress, the brain is then also going to get stressful. Heart math in training the brain and the heart has become so powerful for stress management, addiction management. It's a big part of our work. We talk about the spirit. The spirit. Again, we do energy work. Somehow our prayer, somehow energy, the human energy system affects how people feel. Meditation, heart math, practical spirituality. We want to help people to connect to this thing that we call the creator or spirit or the quantum field. It doesn't matter what words we use, but scientifically there's something going on out there and we can connect to it. And that becomes what's practical. Mindfulness meditation. So we've used this word now. Mindfulness is just about, it's a process whereby we're here, available to the moment. And there have been study after study after study with lower relapse rates with addicts, with lower anxiety levels, with effectiveness similar to that of antidepressants and therapy. So mindfulness meditation, this whole thing that's intangible, is super important for people that are trying to recover. And we go to step 12, having had a spiritual awakening as a result of these steps. That sounds to me like the product. That's it. Having had a spiritual awakening. Well, everything that we've talked about up until now is leading us to this point. So there's no difference between what we're intending as any other treatment in the country, in the world today. Having a spiritual awakening means that we're now free, meaning I'm no longer owned by the past. I'm no longer a victim of circumstances, that somehow I can train myself to have a better life. And now we have to make the decision whether we believe that we're an addict and we'll be an addict for the rest of our lives, or whether there's something more for you. And hopefully with all the science, all the information that we have just gone over, that maybe there's just a doorway, even if there's a chance that you can experience life in a deeper, richer, more meaningful way. Isn't that worth it? Isn't it worth it to explore what it means to be well instead of what it means to just be managing a set of circumstances, managing my medication? So as we close our presentation, I will ask you the question, what is the most important thing in your life? And do you think it's possible that you can recover? Can you recover your authentic self? Can you recover from addiction based on all the science that we've put out there? Can you be one of those people that are miracles that beat the odds when they've been given a diagnosis and the doctor says you've only got X months to live? You're going to be an addict the rest of your life. You're going to be on this antidepressant the rest of your life. Do you think that it's possible that you don't have to be? And what would that mean to your life? What would that mean to your family and to the richness and meaning of your life? Well, I'm here to tell you that in my own life, I have done just that. After a 30-year history with addiction, I don't consider myself to be an addict anymore because I'm no longer informed by that. It doesn't take up time in my thought process, I've healed it, I've gotten it out of my system, so I'm now available for present moment experiences. And when I'm having a difficult day, it's not because I'm an addict and I'm such an addict and I can't think and it's self-will gone riot. I'm having a bad day because I'm a guy having a bad day. And I'm no longer defining myself by who I've been. I'm now defining myself by what is possible for me. What is possible for my life? What is possible? And if you want to even begin to have that discussion, to think about that, then call the Sanctuary, go to our website, www.sanctuary.net. There's a tremendous amount of information there. It's new information, and it's about all what's possible because I've done it. Everyone that's come to the Sanctuary that works there has done it, and our clients do it. Thus, thank you so much for your time, and I send you such prayers on your journey towards your wellness and empowerment.